Hello, my name is Melissa Conley-Tyler. I'm the Executive Director of AP4D, the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, and I'm joining you here today from the lands of the Ngunnawal people in New South Wales. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge any Indigenous people who are with us today. We are delighted that so many people have joined us for this discussion on what I consider one of the most important topics in the world right now. I think back on the last 12 months and I think of the things that have stayed with me. And so many of them have been about the situation of civilians in the world and the importance of compliance with international humanitarian law. In our video, you saw some images from Ukraine, from the Middle East, and from Sudan. And I think that gives a sense of both the scale and the spread of the issues that we're talking about here today. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to talk about the research that went into this paper on what Australia can be doing to promote compliance with international humanitarian law and protection of civilians. And we'll then have a fantastic panel of the experts we consulted for the report who are going to share their views. So we're welcomed by, we'll have a perspective from the humanitarian perspective from David Tuck, the Australian Head of Mission for the International Committee of the Red Cross. We have an international law perspective from Sarah McCosker, who's the founding partner at Lexbridge Law. And we'll have a practitioner perspective from Kaya Chowdhury, who's from the International Council of Voluntary Agencies. And finally, to finish up, we'll have a response from Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, Lorraine Findlay, who's going to give some reflections on the paper and what it means. Now, for those joining us, if it's useful to you, this is live captioned as always. So look in the chat and follow that live caption bar. And we have enabled question and answer. So we will have a period during this time where you can share your thoughts and comments and questions, and we can make it properly interactive. So many of you, I think, know AP4D quite well. I look around the room and I see people who've been involved in the consultations for this paper and for previous papers. But for those of you who we're perhaps new for, I should just take a moment to give you a sense of what AP4D is and why it's been involved in this area. So AP4D was established by a group of people across Australia's defence, diplomacy, development communities, and the things that don't start with D. And the idea behind it was that in a difficult and contested world, you need all the elements of statecraft working together. I think this paper today is a great example of how those different perspectives are relevant and can work together to solve a current key global problem. So when we're talking about international humanitarian law and protection of civilians, it's not just a defence issue or a diplomacy issue or a development issue. It's all of those Ds plus the things that don't start with D, like international law, law enforcement, etc. AP4D, since we were established, has been lucky enough to be commissioned from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and from the Defence portfolio to look at a range of topics which are relevant to Australian foreign policy. And in particular, we got our start, as it were, and have received continuing support from the Australian Civil Military Centre, which I think showed real vision in seeing the importance of this area, of bringing together these different tools of statecraft and the sort of topics that we can make a real contribution on. So to speak a little more, I'll first welcome Executive Director Nicola Rosenblum to explain a little bit more about ACMC's work on IHL and POC and why it commissioned this paper. Over to you, Nicola.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Really lovely to join you all today. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any First Nations persons joining us here today. So ACMC was established to enhance coordination between Australian civilian, military and police agencies when responding to a crisis. And from our perspective, we believe that effective civil-military police coordination leads to better outcomes for communities affected by crisis. And that's one of the reasons why protection of civilians in armed conflict is a real priority theme for ACMC. So in pursuit of the protection of civilians theme, ACMC conducts a range of activities. So we support research into this area, and this publication that we're talking about today is an example of that. We also conduct training for government and non-government officials. We also bring together people for dialogues and consultations and collaboration to try to build a community of interest around protection of civilians. If you're interested to learn more about ACMC's work on protection of civilians, please reach out. But otherwise, I want to thank AP4D for their contribution to this important topic. As Melissa said, there's never been a more important time for us to all focus on protection of civilians and upholding international humanitarian law. It's so important for so very many of the crises and conflicts that we see around the world today. And so thank you very much to AP4D for their contribution, and I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Nicola. So I'm going to hand over now to Grant Wyeth, who is the Senior Policy Analyst who has worked on pulling this paper together. So along with Heather Rathel, he conducted all of the consultations, the group ones, the individual ones that brought together the ideas and perspectives that we're presenting. And then he was involved in, obviously, the editing process. And I think it's particularly fitting given that Grant has been working with AP4D since the very, very first papers that we launched with the support of ACMC. Over to you, Grant.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you for everyone in attendance. So as Melissa said, I'll provide a brief overview of the paper, but the paper is now live online and ready for you to read. So the process began with an initial dialogue at the ACFD conference in Sydney in October last year, where we had some fabulous speakers in David Tuck, who's joining us today as well, Helen Durham and Juliet Bressington. From there, we held a series of working groups and individual consultations with more than 70 experts from Australia and the region to discuss current issues around international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians. And we thank everyone who contributed their time and expertise to the process. And I'll just give a special thanks to ACFD and the ACFD Humanitarian Reference Group, as well as the International Council for Voluntary Agencies. The ideas we gathered for this paper were then synthesized into the final product that we're launching today. And so the purpose of the paper was not to create a consensus from all of our consultees, but to source a number of different ideas and perspectives to provide an overview of current issues and various pathways that could be pursued. Which brings us to the paper itself. So just a note, instead of wasting a lot of time on saying international humanitarian law and protection of civilians multiple times, I'll just use the acronyms IHL and POC. So one of the key findings is the scale of the global problem. The world is currently suffering the highest number of conflicts since World War II. There are record highs of internally displaced people, with high numbers of civilian casualties and damage to critical infrastructure, as well as record high number of deaths of humanitarian workers. This is being compounded by a breakdown in the multilateral architecture designed to uphold IHL and POC. So what can Australia do? Consultations emphasise that Australia should not underestimate its influence. Middle power coalitions will be increasingly important in an era of great power revisionism. It's important that Australia uses its voice to maintain attention and focus on issues of IHL and POC, and for Australia to develop an understanding of how it can use all its tools of statecraft to be influential. So what does it look like for Australia to promote compliance with IHL and POC? There is now an international space for Australia to take a bold leadership role in IHL and POC, enhancing its moral power. There's a need for Australia to become outspoken in addressing IHL violations, regardless of who the perpetrators are, as a lack of consistency does incredible damage to the international legal system. To facilitate this, Australia recognises that IHL and POC are broad-based endeavours, that they require political and diplomatic perspectives, defense and security perspectives, and humanitarian perspectives. So the paper outlines 11 focus areas that Australia can advance to achieve this vision. I won't go into all of them, but just to name a couple of them, there is one important one is revising counterterrorism legislation to allow humanitarian organizations to operate with greater ease in conflict zones, and for Australia to take a leadership role in regulating the evolving lethal technologies like autonomous weapons. So that's just a brief overview of what the paper is. As I said, the paper is now online and you can go and read it in full. But I think it's now time to turn over to the discussion with the panelists and get their perspective on some of the more in-depth commentary on these issues. So as Melissa said, today we have joining us David Tuck, the Australian Head of Mission at the International Committee for the Red Cross. We have Sarah McCloskey, founding partner at Lexbridge Lawyers, and Kaya Saha Chowdhury, Asia Pacific Regional Representative at the International Council of Voluntary Agencies. Following a discussion with those three, here we are, sorry, get the slide up. Following the discussion with those three, we will also hear from Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, Lorraine Finlay. So I'll turn over now to the panel. So I'll start with Sarah. Sarah, to ground the conversation, let's start with some definitions. Could you please give us an overview of the basics? What do we mean when we say international humanitarian law and POC? And what are they and how are they related?
Thank you, Grant, and good afternoon to all. And thank you to APD for the invitation to be part of this panel and for launching this initiative on this very timely topic. So when we refer to international humanitarian law, we're referring to the body of rules that apply in times of armed conflict to limit the effects of armed conflict for humanitarian reasons. So otherwise known as the law of armed conflict or the law of war. So this IHL does not relate to or govern the reasons for or the legalities of going to war. That's the subject of a separate body of international law, which is the law on the use of force. Instead, IHL is the law that applies when there's an armed conflict taking place, and it also applies to situations of military occupation. And it applies to conflicts that are international in nature, so between two or more states. And it also applies to conflicts that involve non-state actors as well, for example, civil wars. So what IHL does fundamentally is to place limits on the methods and means of warfare. And so a key concept underpinning IHL is that there are important limits on the measures that armed forces and other actors can take to conduct hostilities during armed conflict.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. That's fantastic. That gives us a good grounding in what we'll be discussing going forward. So I might turn to David now. So David, the UN Secretary-General has described the current state of IHL and POC compliance as an age of impunity. What are the key challenges to IHL and POC currently in your view?
Yeah, thanks very much, Grant, and thank you so much for having me. Thanks, I should say, to the Australian Civil Military Centre for ensuring that we have this topic of protection of civilians on the radar and consistently on the radar. I think that's really testament to an open and transparent discussion in Australia. Thank you to AP4D for the report. Of course, I think it's excellent. On the challenges in respect of protection of civilians, I'll begin a little bit by reiterating indeed what you said, Grant, and what's in the report, and that's to say the overarching challenge is, of course, conflict itself, a steadily increasing number of conflicts if you go by the ICRC's metrics, which are founded in international law, and conflicts that very unfortunately are often intractable, extremely difficult to resolve. There's a sort of rhetorical question that we ask ourselves in the ICRC, which goes something like this. See how many conflicts of the last 15 years you can name that you believe have reached a final and peaceful resolution. And you might find that the answer is very, very few, which would suggest that political solutions are unfortunately very hard to come by. On the battlefield as such, and I think a lot of this is rightly picked up in the report, we're at this sort of intersection between some significant developments in terms of technology, artificial intelligence, with, of course, machine learning. We're looking at domains that we're perhaps a bit less familiar with, like cyber and space. And yet at the same time, I'm keen to recall that in many of the conflicts where we work, harm caused to civilians is by more traditional or conventional means and methods of warfare. You see things like siege, which is a method that's been around since warfare began. So we're at this interesting technological intersection. Interesting, I say, but I mean, of course, difficult and potentially problematic. We're also facing a very fast-changing information environment, which I personally think will be one of the most significant factors for civilians in conflict if we look ahead. On Grant, the question of impunity, I mean, great question. I will just pose three ideas that all overlap, and I'll do so very, very quickly. One is to suggest, without being naive about it, we need to be cautious with this, but I would suggest that there might be more accountability than we are commonly or popularly aware, meaning to say in some domestic jurisdictions there is accountability. I've been having this discussion with colleagues from the Philippines, for example. In some even military sort of more administrative processes, they deal with issues related to the enforcement of IHL. We also know that IHL can be enforced by some courts under different heads or under different alleged crimes, meaning to say sometimes it's easier to prosecute murder than it is to prosecute the war crime of murder. But in fact, it's the same events that are under discussion. Second, I'd recall only that when we think about the enforcement of IHL, let's not only think about individual criminal responsibility. The enforcement framework of this body of law is huge. And I would argue the most important thing for enforcement is sort of peer-to-peer or state-to-state influence. I think that's where you really get leverage, traction, and change, in my personal view. But there's more than that. And finally, just to say, I think on the question of the enforcement of IHL, we ought to just be a little cautious not to think only of international platforms, mechanisms, and processes. Certainly at the ICRC, we're really keen to come back to focusing on states, individual states' responsibilities as the owner of IHL. We've just launched an initiative called the Global Initiative to Galvanize Political Support for IHL. It doesn't lend itself to an acronym, but it is intended specifically to reiterate states' individual responsibility for issues related to humanitarian law.
Okay, thanks, David. That's a fantastic overview of some of the issues currently with compliance, and I guess, yeah, having that jurisdictional understanding of these issues and the breadth of actually ideas that we're actually trying to create law around here as well. So thank you very much for that. I'll turn to Kaya now. So Kaya, we hear a lot, I guess we hear a lot in the news about Gaza and Ukraine and maybe to a lesser extent Sudan. But what are some of the IHL POC's challenges closer to home here in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, thanks very much, Grant, and for having me. As others have said, I really support having this conversation at this point in time. It's critical. When you think of Asia Pacific, yes, you don't necessarily at this moment think of conflict. And I think, though, it's important to remember it's a region that has been shaped a lot by conflict. We've seen in the Sri Lanka War, decades of fighting within Afghanistan. It is hosts 7 million refugees and 5 million IDPs at this point, not solely, but a lot displaced by conflict. It is also maybe lesser known, a lot of some of the conflicts within the region are non-international armed conflicts. And so as we were hearing, we have smaller scale, more localized in Pakistan, in Balochistan, in southern Philippines, southern Thailand. But the one that is most prominent now and comes to the radar is obviously the situation within Myanmar. If you look at the ACLED database, which looks at armed conflict location and event database, Myanmar is one of, I think, the fourth conflict in the world that is most dangerous for civilians. We are seeing many threats and challenges to protection of civilians, including attacks on healthcare and infrastructure. We're seeing the use of air and drone strikes on civilian populations. It has overtaken Syria in terms of the use of landmine casualties in 2024, forced recruitment of populations and civilians, use as human shields, stopping to humanitarian assistance. So as you can see, a huge range of challenges. I think there's over 19 million deemed to be in need, and over 3 million that have been displaced by conflict in Myanmar. And I think to the challenges that we see, and this is not exclusive to the region, but I think is this tension that can happen between respect and IHL being customary, but also seeing the need for state sovereignty and independence and non-interference, and how that impacts how we support around some of these challenges. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Kaya. And I think one of the other challenges here is being able to get attention onto these issues in our local region. You know, obviously the Ukraine and Gaza take up a lot of column inches in our newspapers, but we need to be actually paying attention to what's going on close at home as well. So I'll just give a reminder that we will be having an audience Q&A following this initial session from some questions from me. So if you have any questions or comments for the panel, please think about them now and put them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to them in a minute. So I'll turn back to Sarah now. So back to the idea of compliance. So why is compliance in Australia's interests?
Thanks, Grant. Well, I think there are really many reasons why it's in Australia's interest to comply with IHL and to promote compliance with it. I'd give 3 key reasons at the outset. So firstly, adhering to IHL helps minimise harm to civilians and maintain humanitarian and moral standards. In practical terms, complying with IHL helps save lives, it helps limit unnecessary suffering and reduce the humanitarian impacts of warfare. So there's that first reason is really about protecting civilians. Secondly, there's a reciprocity argument here. So Australia complying with IHL when we're a party to an armed conflict increases the likelihood that adversaries will also adhere to these rules. And so it, again, provides better protection for our own military personnel and civilians. So mutual respect for IHL can reduce the overall brutality of armed conflict. So compliance with IHL actually benefits all parties to the armed conflict and also those who are impacted by it. So a third reason is about reputation and legitimacy. So compliance with IHL will enhance a country's international reputation and legitimacy. And if we respect IHL, this leads to stronger diplomatic relationships and partnerships because other countries and international organizations are more likely to cooperate with countries that uphold humanitarian principles. So those are 3 key reasons, but briefly I'd mention that there are many others, and a few others would relate to humanitarian access. For example, adhering to IHL has a really practical positive impact on the ground because it helps to facilitate the smooth delivery of humanitarian aid and ensures that water, food, medical care can actually reach those in need. Also, it assists with long-term stability because by adhering to IHL, countries can help build trust, promote reconciliation, and create those really critical foundations for lasting peace and security. And just lastly, I'd mention legal accountability. If we comply with IHL, this has a deterrent effect because it indicates that those who violate IHL, if they commit war crimes, for example, or other serious violations, it sends a signal that those things will be brought to justice, which then also reduces the risk of legal consequences for individuals in the states. So in summary, I'd say compliance with IHL is not just about upholding humanitarian principles and moral values and being a good international citizen. It has very important practical benefits for Australia and others.
Well, thanks, Sarah. And I think that speaks to, I think, something that else is going on in the world, which is the wave of cynicism that we have in the world. And so consistency and really focusing on Australia's reputation is incredibly important. So I'll come back to David now. So David, sometimes there seems to be a disconnect between humanitarian policy and humanitarian law discussions. So how are we able to bridge this gap?
Yeah, thanks, Grant. I think you're right. I think there is sometimes a disconnect between law and policy. If I was pushed, I would say there are also other disconnects of which we ought to be a little bit mindful. And the one that comes to me right now is particularly, say, law and technology. I think what we're seeing is that the latter, the technology part of the discussion, moves ahead extremely quickly, and sometimes the law part, particularly when you think about international processes to develop or interpret the law, moves relatively slowly. My impression, and it may just be a sign of my lack of ICT and related skills, but my impression is there are very few people who are truly strongly conversant in both the law and the technology aspects attached to some of these contemporary issues. So that's certainly another area. On the law and policy, look, if the audience is interested, I would encourage them to consider a report that was released by the ICRC in about September last year, which is called IHL and the Challenges of Contemporary Armed Conflict, because that touches on a couple of issues. Sounds like a legal report, but it actually touches on issues that I believe are quite sort of policy oriented. I'll flag just two very quickly. In that report, the ICRC notes some of its concerns that today there is a slight risk that law compliant behaviour is on occasion, globally I mean, on occasion described as being subject or pursuant to a sort of policy or best practices decision. In other words, we're seeing actors describe behaviour which is required by the law as somehow being above and beyond it's a policy or best practice decision that we are choosing to do. Now, of course, we appreciate the compliant behaviour that underpins that, but the problem with that narrative is it diminishes very quickly the legal weight of the rules that actually require them to act in a certain way. So that's of concern to us. The other, and this is perhaps of more concern, is that we have a tendency at the moment to witness justifications or explanations of behaviour that on the face of it would actually be unlawful under IHL, but it is now being justified on sort of expedient interpretations of the law to explain more permissive behaviour. So behaviour that actually in this balance of humanitarian law leads more towards military necessity and away from the principle of humanity. And some of those interpretations, I suspect, are in furtherance of policy objectives or indeed military objectives. And the concern being with expedient interpretations where we might end up in terms of the integrity of the law in 5, 10, 15 years from now. Look, on bridging this gap between law and policy, I'm sure others here in this conversation have a lot of great ideas around this. I would say only the obvious ones, that your policymakers have to understand a certain amount of the law. And in Australia, the Australian Red Cross is very good at disseminating international humanitarian law. I'd say here, when we talk about policymakers for IHL, we also mean military decision makers and operators. They have such a big stake in international humanitarian law. And then I think I'm allowed to say, as a recovering lawyer, that also you need lawyers who have a little bit of policy savvy, because the law in abstracto, disconnected from reality, is not, terribly useful to anyone who's actually on the ground. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Grant.
Thanks, David. That's fantastic. And I think that last point is a critical one to recognize as well. So I'll turn back to Kaya. So Kaya, the ICVA is a global network of non-governmental organizations whose mission is to make humanitarian action more principled and effective. How are your members navigating current IHL and POC challenges?
Yeah, thank you. I think I want to be clear. What would help them navigate most is compliance and reduce conflict, because it is very difficult for aid workers at the moment globally to be able to responding and navigating these challenges alone. And I do want to point to the other is the depoliticization of humanitarian assistance. What we are currently seeing with cuts to funding that are affect immediately is affecting people who are on the ground, who have to explain today why the distribution of food might not be going ahead, why the health service somebody wanted is not available. And when we start to say that aid is linked to you can only address certain populations, or you won't be able to meet the needs based on the need alone, then you start to challenge the principles, which I say underpin the importance of why it is protected and humanitarian assistance is protected. So for our members, their role is, how do we make sure, to the best of our ability, we work with partners in the sector to make sure that humanitarian action is principled and effective, and how can that be understood? And I think something we need to realize with a lot of people who are responding might not come from traditional humanitarian law backgrounds. We have actors that we're shifting in environments from development to humanitarian that have a range of first responders. And I think having that culture of compliance is really important. And so a lot of our members reach out about support around humanitarian negotiation training, which looks at the principles, how do you uphold them in ethical dilemmas? It talks about dialogues like this and breaking it down. I think what can turn people away sometimes from these discussions is that they might think, oh, I don't understand it. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how this can help or what this means for my humanitarian action and what role I play. And I think it's really important to have those discussions break down. So there's different working with expert partners like ICRC, Red Cross movements, Geneva Call, MSF to promote these discussions. There is also within the policy space a lot of efforts. ICFA sits in the Interagency Standing Committee, which works on humanitarian policy and guidance, and to make NGO voices around the challenges that are affecting their ability to deliver assistance effectively is feeding into those policy. And I think, again, that peer exchange is really valuable in these discussions and how you can navigate these challenges, because they're not easy. There are often no good options for responders. And I think that support at all levels is key to ensuring that humanitarian assistance and that access, as Sarah was saying, remains in crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaya. That's fantastic. So I'll just remind everyone that we do have a Q&A session coming up. We'll just have one more round of questions from me. So any questions, please put them in the Q&A section in the Zoom chat. So I'll come back to Sarah. So Sarah, impunity can often seem like an intractable problem. What are some of the ways in which a country like Australia can influence others to comply?
Thanks, Grant. Well, Australia has a really wide toolbox of measures that we can have at our disposal to induce or influence another state to respect IHL. I think of this as a kind of humanitarian law and diplomacy toolbox, and these tools take different forms, and I think of them as being organised along a spectrum that increases in diplomatic strength and political bite. So at one end of the spectrum is a range of preventive measures, so aimed at preventing violations before they occur. And I think these measures really focus on ensuring that a wide range of actors understand IHL and the limits that it imposes to help influence actors' behaviour. And so some of these kinds of tools would include providing education and training about IHL to armed forces and armed groups, civil society and the community more broadly. Also, very importantly, confidential dialogue with parties to armed conflict and making diplomatic representations. And it's really important, I think, for us to bear in mind that many of the most important and effective ways that a country can influence others to comply with IHL is through humanitarian diplomacy that is behind the scenes and out of the public eye. So political dialogue, mediation, lending out good offices and so on. But of course, there are also more public measures that could be taken. So public statements, speeches, declarations, diplomatic démarches, or appeals. But of course, resolutions in international fora, whether that's the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly. And then, of course, there's a range of stronger measures and mechanisms that Australia has at its disposal. So these could include things like conducting investigations or fact-finding, either at a domestic or international level, and of course, prosecuting alleged IHL violations through courts and tribunals. And then again, with increasing political and economic bite, measures such as imposing autonomous sanctions or supporting UN sanctions, financial sanctions, visa bans, flight bans. And then there's a whole range of measures that can be taken to restrict arms exports to parties to armed conflicts. For example, taking into account Australia's obligations under treaties like the Arms Trade Treaty. One last set of tools that I'll mention is within our defence and military engagement with our allies and partners and states that we are partnering with on various activities. Australia can demonstrate standard setting and modelling good conduct in the ways that we conduct those military engagement activities. So there's a whole wide range of tools in the toolbox. And I guess the last thing I would say is that because the reasons for non-compliance are very diverse, it's important for states to select the right tools for the right circumstances. The common denominator is that all these tools seek to influence the behaviour of others. And some of these tools, they're not used in isolation. They can be used in concert with each other and in coordination with other states.
Thanks, Sarah. And that's a fantastic overview of the sheer breadth of tools that Australia has at its disposal, and I guess how it can coordinate tools within its own arms of foreign and defence policy, but also with coalitions with other states as well. So if those are the tools, I'll turn over to David and ask, what are some of the broad principles that should guide Australia's work in this space? How can Australia build and strengthen a culture of compliance?
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Grant. And let me also just say very quickly that I think many of the things that Kea and Sarah have said absolutely resonate and very, very well articulated. If we think about sort of overarching principles, trying to take that a little bit from an ICRC type perspective, a humanitarian type perspective, I think one of the first ones might be that it's necessary, I think, to have a mindset in which protection of civilians is first and foremost one's own responsibility and prerogative, and just to avoid a narrative that sometimes creeps in, which is to suggest that protection of civilians is going to some far-flung country to protect people from a particularly nefarious actor. Though that might be true in some cases, don't get me wrong, but it really does start with the behavior of one's own armed and security forces, particularly if we're talking about conflict, but also all parts of government, as has rightly been mentioned. So I think that's important. And in AP4D's report, I think that's summarized really well with this notion of walk the talk. I mean, that captures it very, very, very well. Second element, perhaps, and this ties into precisely what Sarah was just saying, is that then, in addition, influencing to the greatest extent possible one's particularly partners, allies, and proxies. I mean, those entities with whom one works most commonly, finding all possible areas of leverage to try and ensure compliance with IHL, I think is absolutely a key pillar, and I think very central to making sure that this can work globally. This notion, I mentioned it, of peer-to-peer influence. The third, and I'm not sure if this is narrow or zooming out a bit, but the third element I'll flag is just a little bit definitional, meaning to say that our suggestion would be to think as broadly as possible about some of these notions. It is true that if you take a very specific IHL worldview, it's actually not just civilians, though we tend to talk most about civilians. It's not just civilians. It's also sick, wounded, shipwrecked detainees, and these people will all be of the enemy or opposing armed forces. It's actually an interesting historical thing about IHL that when it began, it wasn't really about civilians. It was about protecting the wounded of the enemy, and that is still true today. And I think that is really key. I mean, IHL applies to protect one's soldiers once out of the combat. So just to flag that. For civilians as such on POC, I think our recommendation would be just to avoid the narrower reflection that civilian harm is casualties, meaning deaths and injuries. Yes, of course, that is true, sadly, but also civilian harm is much, 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 much broader. I mean, it's a civilian subject to an insufficient or poorly managed legal process as they go through their detention experience. It's individuals who are missing their family members. It's a lack of access to healthcare, and so on and so on and so forth. And it's kind of very very broad notion. I think this is just really repeating Sarah's sort of wide toolbox notion. I think the good news here is that one of the major limitations is only our creativity. There are so many different things you can do to try and push this agenda forward. And Sarah particularly will know that I often think sometimes of the really granular ones, like, for example, any soldier standing next to his or her counterpart from a foreign or another armed forces, helping him or her understand how to use his or her weapon in a way that is both militarily efficient but also spares civilians. That's already making a very granular contribution to protection of civilians on the battlefield. So it really ranges from macro UN abstract and lawmaking all the way down to what happens, day to day in the dust, so to speak.
Oops, sorry, I just was on mute there. I think that's a fantastic overview of the principles that we're looking at here. But I guess turning back to Kaya, when we're thinking about NGOs and the work that they do on the ground, what is the best way that Australia can support these NGOs in order to deliver the work that they're doing around IHL and POC?
Yeah, thank you. And I think Sarah and David already covered a lot in terms of, again, that toolbox, because we have to think of those that are trying to deliver assistance within this broader system, right? So that culture of compliance, those discussions will be critical in enabling those that are providing assistance to do that effectively. I like, the concept of peer-to-peer exchange, and I think is really critical. And it comes out in the report, as you're saying, to be that bold regional leader, right? And looking at that. And I think Australia's in a number of forums. It has that opportunity to have space and dialogue, and as they're saying, nuanced discussions around different aspects, right? I know within the region, these aren't necessarily best had publicly. They are had in certain spaces and where there is a degree of trust between peers. I was recently at an event which was on a different topic, but brought together leaders from Australia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. And a lot of those commented on that benefit of coming together. So I think providing those spaces and supporting those spaces. From a policy perspective, and well, from a perspective of someone who supports humanitarian assistance across the globe, I think it's having those supportive policies. So like that investment in understanding of IHL and these dialogues. I think in Australia's humanitarian strategy, it refers to a lot around preparedness and resilience. And I think it's important to think about that in this context as well. If we get to the heart of a conflict and we start talking about these things, it is very difficult to bring around. We need to start earlier and have this understood. So I think those aspects, you touched on it earlier in terms of some of the recommendations that came out in the discussions around looking at sanctions and humanitarian exemptions, around making an enabling policy. We've seen with the number of casualties that have been with humanitarian aid workers that have been killed as well, is support for more risk management, right? And that being included in budgets, and particularly when you're supporting or in partnership with local actors who have to manage their risk to very difficult places. So having flexible policies that allow for those to work within conflict settings, to know you can't at a granular level have receipts coming from the field, maybe in your conflict and you're hiding in jungles or things like that. Like it's just having that understanding of the operating environment, and those policies that can be enabling will also go, I think, a long way in supporting actors. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaya. And yeah, that's absolutely critical in understanding the conditions on the ground that NGOs are dealing with. So let's turn to a few audience questions now. I'll start with one which seems to be the most difficult one at the moment. And I think maybe this is one for David. So from an anonymous attendee, what more can be done to prevent arms carriers and non-state armed groups infiltrating or occasionally using humanitarian organizations' vehicles and facilities for military purposes? So the questioner is really thinking about hybrid warfare here, and where it's increasingly difficult to distinguish between civilians, combatants, non-state military actors, and humanitarians.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. What can be done to avoid non-state armed groups and or others, using humanitarian actors as some sort of shield or disguise? I mean, to a certain extent, I think it's all of the range of tools that are available to us to address issues related to humanitarian access and compliance. I mean, the ICRC's main mode of action in that particular situation would be first and foremost confidential bilateral dialogue. That's just the way that we approach trying to influence behavior. It's our advocacy or persuasion tool, if you'd like to think about it like that. Of course, other actors use other tools to try and influence and persuade to avoid precisely this sort of problem. There is an element, I think, to what you're saying as well of evidently humanitarian actors themselves have an extremely strong interest to make sure that their emblem is not misused. And of course, the emblem, when we think of the Red Cross, is actually protected by law. So there might be legal tools in certain situations to address some of that misuse or abuse, as it can sometimes be called. But I think professional humanitarian actors will do their utmost to avoid being misconceived as being aligned in one way or another to any one of the parties to armed conflict.
Thanks, David. That's an excellent response. So we've got a question here from Morten Pedersen, who asks, in Myanmar, one of the limitations to effective protection of civilians is the reluctance of many international donors and agencies to work with non-state armed groups, which are often leading the humanitarian response on the ground. What are the legal and political restrictions on Australian humanitarians in this efforts in this respect, if any? So I think maybe Sarah, that might be one for you.
Thank you, Grant. But I actually can see that perhaps Melissa might wish to say a few words on this first. Melissa, I'll pass to you.
I'm putting my video back on. Hello. I was not expecting to speak because I'm very conscious of the people who are experts who have given their comments on this for this paper. One of the strong recommendations from the paper is to enable humanitarians to be doing their job in places like Myanmar. A strong recommendation from the people we spoke to is that the current system, particularly around counterterrorism financing, prevents them from doing the jobs that they wish to, that it's very difficult for them on the field. We also had other comments around funding structures and the way that direct funding would sometimes be very much more useful in this way. So I'd refer people to the recommendations, the focus areas in the paper for more information on that. And can I hand back to Sarah?
Sure, Melissa. Yeah, I think this is a very tricky set of issues, and again, would encourage others, to read the paper's recommendations on this. I mean, I think we are in a very challenging. I would probably just give a couple of general remarks. I mean, we are in a period where issues around funding are to those who are being impacted by armed conflict are going to be really crucial to resolve, and where funding is withdrawn because of some of the concerns about, say, for example, from an international law perspective, state responsibility implications. What if we give funding to a particular entity and that entity may be involved or implicated in alleged violations of human rights and humanitarian law? Often states like Australia and also UN entities have very strict risk assessment processes that preclude us from giving funding in such circumstances. But there are some complexities there, because if sometimes those assessments are based on past activities, some of them are based on existing data about activities that are likely to occur. And so there's a lot of complexity in that space, because if you exclude operating with a number of people on the ground, you're being impeded from providing important humanitarian assistance to people as well. So there are legal complexities, there are political sensitivities involved, and I would say, and I encourage others to chime in on this if they wish to, but there aren't easy solutions. I think other than having quite clear guidance frameworks as well as particular exemptions, but those exemptions have to be implemented very, very carefully, and they have to be, I think what's crucial for all of this is reliance on accurate data. And this is an issue that others will be aware of, but how do you get real-time accurate data about what's been happening in the field, who can be trusted, who may have question marks over their behavior? But I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Sarah. That's fantastic. So just with an eye on the time, I think I'll fuse a few questions together for Kaya. So Alan Hewson from ACFID has asked, in the context of increasing reports on humanitarian workers, particularly local workers, being killed in armed conflict, what are some of the key inclusions that Australian civil society can argue for in the development of the Declaration of the Rights of Humanitarian Personnel? And there's also a question from James Hunt about the role of the media in assisting advocacy for IHL compliance and POC, and another anonymous question about what can drive women's greater inclusion in leadership in peace building. So there might be a whole lot there for you, Kaya, but maybe there's some themes that cross over there, and you can take what you want out of those questions.
Yeah, thank you for those. I'll think of how, say, best to frame it. And maybe if I start backwards with the role of women in some of these discussions, and I think we've seen in many contexts, and again, I say Myanmar, the important role that women play. And I think Australia, recently had its launch of its policy, and last week there was a discussion around women, peace and security. So I think making sure, as others have said, that having a whole of sector and working with different components within the governments and within partners is really key to being able to address some of these challenges. In terms, I think there was also some around the media and preparedness, I think, as well, around the POC discussion. And I think something David had touched on before was around, the misinformation and we're in this very difficult age. And I think being able to have very clear discussions, but also to challenge some of these narratives that are coming out about what is the reality on the ground will be really key in navigating this space. And also, I think, a responsibility as well to look and talk with media of how do we make sure we're getting the real stories of what is happening and what is really what is occurring, because I think things can spread so much faster than we have seen previously, which is a big challenge. In terms of what can go into the declaration, I'll also ask others to jump in who may know a bit more of where that is at this point. But I think we've talked about some of the sanctions discussions, understanding the needs of humanitarian workers being properly supported and prepared to be operating in these environments will be key. And again, the policies and talking with those that are delivering assistance on how best to ensure that they are protected in the different circumstances they are working. But others may want to come in on that.
If there isn't any other additional commentary from Sarah and David, I might, just with an eye on the time, I might thank everyone for their contributions. That has been absolutely fantastic, and you've really given us a lot of great insights into the current situation and what can be done moving forward. And so for our final reflections on the paper, we're delighted that Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, Lorraine Finlay, has been able to join us today to offer her expertise. So I'll hand things over to Lorraine.
Well, Thank you so much. And I think I have the easiest job in the world, simply in terms of saying it has been such an interesting, clear and informative discussion that I actually think there's very little that I could add to the expertise that we've already heard. But I really did want to thank AP4D for leading this work and the ACMC for commissioning the research, and then also the three panellists we've heard from today, who I think have really highlighted why this issue at this point in time continues to just be so critical for us to be thinking about. And when I was reading through an advanced copy of the paper that I was fortunate enough to get a little bit before today, and then listening to the conversation, there are two real points that I think have emerged quite strongly that I will continue to reflect on after today, and I hope that you may too. And the first is really about the nature of the conversation that we're having, because questions around conflict and harm rightly bring with them a huge amount of emotion. And I don't know about you, but at the moment when I look at what's happening in the world, it is so easy to be really overwhelmed and quite despairing at where things are. And when we talk about current conflicts, it's really hard to look at them objectively, and it feels impossible to divorce them, and we don't want to divorce them from their human context. But that's where IHL is so critical to me, because it actually provides a North Star that can help to guide us and remind us of that need to steer a principled path, even in moments of crisis and doubt and fear. And I think even at the very worst of times, having that North Star there to shine the way is incredibly important and critical to remind us of the need to stick to these principles and be guided by them regardless of the politics of the day, and to remind us of the importance of standing firmly behind these principles at a time when I fear they're under more stress and pressure than perhaps they ever have been in our recent history. So that's my first reflection about the sheer importance of this discussion at this point in this time, in terms of having those clear guiding principles to help guide us. I think the second thing which attaches to that is to think about the purpose of these discussions and why it is that this is something that Australia should be thinking about and should be investing in. And I know it was mentioned a number of times, discussions around IHL are often primarily couched in moral terms or humanitarian terms. And, I hope it's not surprising to have a human rights commissioner say that I think that should be enough. The mere fact that this is morally the right thing to do should be the end of the discussion. However, I think a really important point that's been raised by this research and by the discussion today is that actually it's not just the moral imperative that's critical here, but actually that Australia's engagement with IHL and POC is a strategic necessity. And I think this research has enormous practical value in highlighting that point, that upholding IHL is the right thing to do, but it also strengthens our national security. It reinforces our international standing, and it enhances the operational effectiveness of our defence and diplomatic efforts. So Australia's commitment to IHL, alongside our broader commitment to human rights, is not just about an abstract ideal. It's actually a fundamental component of our strategic approach to global security and diplomacy. And by promoting compliance with IHL and the protection of civilians, we're not just doing what's right, we're actually securing our long-term interests in a really complex and evolving geopolitical landscape. So this research, to me, makes such a practical contribution to underscoring that point, and it's research that I think makes a really valuable contribution to help guide Australia's thinking as we try to navigate those changing landscapes. So thank you so much for inviting me to share some reflections today, and thank you again to the panellists, who I think have just done an incredible job in really highlighting the core issues that are the foundations of this research paper that I'd encourage you all to read and to share.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. And I think you're right. This is not just a moral imperative; it's a strategic imperative, and that's what's come through all the speakers today, and it comes through in the paper as well. So I'd just like to, in closing, I'd like to thank all the speakers who have joined us today for your time and your expertise. It's been fantastic. Thanks to everyone who got us to this point: advisory group members, consultees, everyone involved in the process. Thanks to everyone in attendance for their interest and their questions. A reminder to check out the publication, which is now live on our website, and to share it around through all your networks. Thanks to ACMC for their support, the ACFID staff, the wider AP4D team for making this program possible. And to tell everyone to get involved, please subscribe to our mailing list or connect with us on social media. And yeah, thank you very much for all your time, and have a good day, everybody.